Hello one and all, I'm Pipes and I'd like to welcome you to this Practical Workflow for Artists tutorial on physical-based rendering. Now, I've had quite a few questions and queries while I've been making the Abandoned Cinema Scene 80s Street Scene development videos and asking what is the physically based rendering system and why am I using it. Well, a lot of the new studios at the moment, the big studios, are using physically based rendering setups for the gaming to make things look more realistic and also to make textures more uniform between the technicians and the actual artists themselves by using correct values for different materials that will work in all different lighting conditions. Now, I'm not a physicist. I'm a 3D artist and texture artist, environment artist, texture artist. So I'm no physicist. So when it comes to things like this, it takes quite a while for me to kind of get my head around it. All I want to know is how do I create these textures and how do I make them looking spot on and really good in my scenes, and also when I'm working in studios, to make sure that all my textures are correct for their actual art treatment and the values are also correct. So after looking on the internet quite extensively, there's quite a few PowerPoint slides and presentations that the big studios have done at Sigograph and different places which outline sort of like some of the basics of physical based rendering. But the best one that I've found so far is this one you can see in front of you here. It's the Marmoset Toolbag 2 learning page, which goes through the basic theory of physically based rendering and also it goes through physical based rendering in practice. Now, as you can see, I'll put the links in the actual description so you can have a good read through yourself, because I'm not going to go through every part of this because it'd be pointless when you can just have a look yourselves. But it's by Jeff Russell, and this is probably the best tutorial set of tutorials I've found for physically based rendering for someone like myself who doesn't want to go into the real in-depth into the physics of it, which is more the program, the technical artists who want to look at that. What I just want to know is some of the basics of this physical based rendering. So, as you can see, as we scroll down, he goes through diffusion and reflection, such as when light waves hit a surface here, how if the surface is quite smooth, the reflection, the light will bounce off at the same angle, such as throwing a ball against a wall. And some surfaces actually take in the light rays and they all bounce around, and then they come back out of the surface, inheriting some of the colour properties. Now, there's also translucency and transparency and energy conservation. As I say, it's a good idea to click on these, have a good read through them, because they're very informative. Such as with metals, how the highlight can take on some of the colour of the actual metal itself. Such as it says here, the colouring of reflection is rare, even amongst conductors, but it does occur in everyday materials like gold, copper, and brass. And this is very important for your highlights when you're doing any metals. He also discusses Fresnel, which is, as you can see from this chart, this has been in, for example, the CryEngine 3 shaded model for quite a while and also in Unreal. You can see regarding reflectivity, say on this sphere, if it's chrome, if you look at it from the center, you would see a reflection, and as you start to glance at the edge, if you sort of squatted down and start to glance at the edge, you would see that it's 100% reflective. And this is actually the same for rubber. As you can see here, the base reflective, if you look straight down in it, there's hardly any reflection at all, but then as you start to look at the glancing angle, you can start to see that a reflection becomes apparent. Now, there's another factor involved, which is microsurface, which is in effect it's the roughness of the actual surface the light is bouncing off of. So the light is coming in at this angle, the surface is quite rough, so you're going to get quite a blurry reflection. Now, in the old school method of texturing, we used to use gloss maps, which would determine the highlight itself. If it was white in the gloss map, the highlight would be quite sharp and small, and then as if you used more of a darker tone in the gloss map, the reflection would be more blurry. But there, as you can see, it was down to the artist to kind of eyeball and decide what sort of highlight they would want for a certain material, which may only work in one scene, and then when the scene was lit a different way, then that texture wouldn't work correctly. But using PBR, we know with the correct values that the reflection and the textures are going to look spot on in any environment that you put them into. He discusses further again about energy conservation, how when light hits an object it can only reflect the same amount of energy that actually hit it or less. And also the microsurface map is discussed again, because the microsurface map is now called roughness. A roughness map when you use an Unreal Engine 4. So for example here you can see water and mud. The reflectivity is 5% inherently, but the gloss for mud is 16% and the gloss for water is 100%, because obviously the water is smooth whereas the mud is quite rough, so it's got more of a roughness, and that's why the highlight is obviously spread out there. From this point here, there is also an excellent page which is another tutorial by Joe Earthquake Wilson, and he goes further on from what Jeff Russell was discussing in that previous page, and he looks at actually a practical example of using physically based rendering, and there's some excellent information on here. And again, like I said, I'm not a physicist, so I need things to be discussed with me in an artist kind of way, i.e. what's it going to look like and how does it exactly work for the artist. Well, here he goes through such as, again, the concept of energy conservation, that the object cannot reflect more light than it actually receives. And then the Albedo Map, which used to be known as a diffuse map. Some people still call it diffuse, can't get out of the habit, but I always try to call it the Albedo Map now. The differences between the albedo and the old way of doing the diffuse is that we don't bake in any of the lighting. We don't bring in ambient occlusion and multiply that, or bring in cavity maps and overlay that, or curvature. What we're doing here is we're purely just determining the colour of the actual base texture itself. Now the next map is microsurface, and as you can see here, at the grayscale values from black to white, 0.0 being black, this appears quite rough. The actual highlight, the highlight is quite blurred, it's quite rough, and then in the map, as you can see with wood, you'd start to bring up the value and you start to get some sort of highlight into there. Plastic is glossy, so that's nearly at 0.5, so like mid-grey, and then as we go into steels and a mirror, it's 100% glossy because it's not rough. Now the difference is here, if you're using the Unreal Engine 4 setup and also Substance Painter, these values are reversed, and in my eyes it makes more sense, because what it's saying is if something is 100% glossy, that would now be 0.0, and then if it's 100% rough, like this here, this would be on the other side, so it would be white. So if you think of it, if it's called a roughness map, how much roughness is there? If it's at 0.0, there's no roughness, black, it's shiny, and if there's quite a lot of roughness, then you will be looking at white up to 1, and it's always between 0 and 1. So in Unreal Engine 4 you may use a clamp to make sure that the values don't stray negative or above 1 in the actual roughness slot. Then we have reflectivity. Now this is where an artist can decide whether they want to use a reflectivity map or an actual metalness map. Now here's the fundamental difference between it. So it's showing reflectivity here, 0.0 if using a reflectivity, also specular map as it can be called. If it's kind of black, there's no reflection at all, and as it goes through to 1.0, that would be extremely reflective. But the difference is when it comes to metals, if I click on this example here, you can see specular versus metalness map. Or reflectivity map. So here we can see the specular workflow, where in the albedo, the actual metalness is black, in the actual texture itself. So that was the diffuse, the albedo map there. So that's with no lighting information. For metals, that would be black. And then in the specular map, they're actually taking and painting in the colour of what the metal would be. So this is brass here. So this is the colour for brass, which is the correct value for that. So all the way across the project and the scenes, the lighting would look correct because they're going to use this for the actual colour. Now in Unreal Engine 4 and the maps that I normally create when I'm doing a PBR workflow is a metalness map. I just find it a bit easier because what I'll do is wherever it's white it's going to be metal, and wherever it's black it's going to be an insulative. So or an insulator, sorry. So if it's metal, white, and if it's not, it's black. So what this does, the metalness map, it'll actually take that colour for the metal from the actual albedo map, or the diffuse again. So as you can see in here, it was just black where the metal was. Well, this time it's now the colour that we would have had in the specular map is now on the albedo map, and wherever it's white, the metalness map will then use that colour to tint the highlight, as you can see in the example there. And then if we go back, we've got the Fresnel, and as he states here, it should be generally set to 1 in a lock value of 1 with the metalness reflectivity module, and some of the engines actually can compensate for that. Ambient occlusion, you can still bake out ambient occlusion for your textures and your objects. But the thing is, this is not overlaid onto the actual albedo itself. This is placed into a slot that is actually in the shader itself, and there is one in Unreal Engine 4 for ambient occlusion that you can plug that into, and that way it makes sure that the diffuse light is correctly occluded rather than baking it into the actual albedo map. So again, scenes will look correct. And cavity map as well, I've seen in the Unreal Engine 4 documentation that the cavity map can be plugged into the specular slot if you're using a metalness map. So as you probably know, a cavity map just shows the real microsurface dints that are in the mesh itself. So if you were doing the normal maps and you had some very small cracks and crevices, this would be shown in the cavity map as black. And then we also use these ambient occlusion and cavity maps in Substance Designer and also Quixel Dedo Suite, Quixel Mega Suite and Dedo, where you can use that to do edge scratching, and it'll use the actual ambient occlusion and cavity for determining where the edges are, and so it can do the scratches on there and use its procedural texturing. Now this is the main problem at the moment as I'm creating this video, is actually finding material values. It's extremely difficult at the moment. You can do a Google image, you can try searching for IOR reflectance values, and it's just really hard to find anything that's consistent. Once Megascans comes out, there's 1,000+ PBR textures on there, 8K I believe, in size, and they've all been correctly calibrated for the PBR rendering system. So a lot of the things I've been creating at the moment, I may have to go back in if I'm completely way off and just make sure that those values are correct to Megascans. So I would advise definitely getting a hold of a copy of Megascans if possible. And then he finally finishes the tutorial on here looking at the actual creating of the texture. Again, it's a great read to have a look at, and you can see these are his final maps. So that's his albedo there with no lighting information in, the red plastic, and then obviously the paint around there, and then the black metal. And then in the microsurface map, or the roughness map, this is where you can really go to town and start adding in those surface details and using your artistic flair as such, and then doing what you wish to the actual surface of the texture. And using the PBR method, it'll make sure that once the light runs over it, everything will look correct, and it'll really add a lot of detail to your models. He's actually used a reflectivity map instead of a metalness map in this example. So if it was metal, for example, that would have been white instead of this colour, and it would have been picked up from the albedo because that colour would have been placed into there. And the normal maps are exactly the same, and nothing's changed, which is awesome. So as I say, what I'll do is I'll make sure, there's also some artists Q&As and some brilliant examples here from various artists, which is worth having a look. So I'll put this into the description, the links for both of these pages, and I would suggest having a look and reading through and seeing if it makes sense to yourself. But let's have a look in a practical example. So as we can see, this is Substance Painter. I'm a huge fan of Algorithmic's products, and Substance Painter is one of my favourites of all time now, along with ZBrush. It's free at the moment while it's in the beta, but you can't export your maps until you actually pay for it, and it's 50% off at the moment, so definitely worth checking this out. And what I've done here is, this is the actual demo mesh that you get when you open up a new project. You make sure that it's on physical based rendering, which it is there, and if for example, here's a base metal, so I've just created a fill layer here, and then I've just gone on here and I've just, if I actually go to the base metal, there we go, double click that, and that's gold. Okay, as you can see, the diffuse color is correct. It's taken from the values for the gold reflectivity of the albedo. And then we've got the height information, so that's if you want to paint in dints or scratches. If I pull it this way, the dints will go inwards. Pull it this way, it will look like it's going outwards, like the normal map. So the height actually is then baked into a normal map. Roughness, it's at pretty much 0, so it's super reflective and shiny, as you can see on the model. Because this is using the Unreal Engine's way of thinking about roughness, where if it's at 0 there's no roughness, and if it's at 1 it's extremely rough. And metallic is at 1 because it's white, so it's just saying, yeah, this is a metal. Okay, so if I press C on the keyboard, we can go through the actual textures at the moment, so we can see the diffuse. That's the height, so there's no height information at the minute. Roughness, that is just pure black, so it's just the roughness. It's very shiny. Metallic, yeah, it's a metal, so everything on this chap's metal, so yeah. And back to diffuse, so if we press M again, we can get back to here. So let's have a look at just a quick practical example. So what I've done is I've created a new layer by clicking the plus icon there. I've created a new layer. I've gone in and I've disabled the diffuse by clicking on the diffuse and then click disable. The height, again, I've disabled that. I've kept roughness as normal, and metallic I've just disabled that because we're just going to be changing the roughness values. So you can leave it on roughness, or you can go to diffuse or whatever. And then down here, I'm going to grab a brush. Let's have a look. I'll grab this dirt brush, double click that, and then it brings up the actual mask for the brush itself. And if we look here, down here, we can paint on the diffuse, roughness, metal and height all at the same time, or we can just paint on just the roughness. So what I'm going to do is, I mean, you'd never do this in reality, obviously, but I'm going to do an exaggerated version of this. I'm going to bring up its roughness quite high to 0.8 and start painting. As you can see, we're starting to lose the actual reflection. And if we look in the actual map itself, what I've just done there is I've painted in white into the roughness map itself. So yeah, it's a white value, so it's got more roughness to it. If I go back down to 0 and go in, and then I can bring it back down, press M to go to material mode, and you can see how it's coming back. So what you would do here is, for example, if you wanted to add a bit of variation into this gold material, is you might just bring up the roughness a little bit, say there was a bit of dirt or grease or something, and then just go in very, very lightly. You can change the flow of the brush here. You can bring the flow down. If you're using a Wacom tablet at the moment, I'm not just using a mouse just for speed for this tutorial. I'm just going in and I'm just lightly blurring off the actual highlights. So it kind of looks like it's got some sort of grease or something like that. It's got some dirt and stains. You could also, if you turn on this roughness variation with the diffuse and put that back to normal, and then we could choose kind of a darkish colour then for the diffuse. So I'm going to paint on the diffuse and the roughness at the same time, and then going in there we can start to see we're starting to get a bit of dirt and variation, and at the same time it's altering the roughness map so that you don't have to go in and separately then place in some more rough values where the dirt might be. There's a good example, you can see it onto the model there. You could also use stencil materials. You could double click one of those and paint through a stencil like you would do in ZBrush, and then that will also take on the properties of whatever the stencil material is for the roughness and the height. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we've got rubber, which is, if I bring it up on here, so we've got the rubber there. The diffuse is quite dark. If you just scroll down. Yep, the diffuse is quite dark. There's no height information. It's got a mid roughness of about 0.5, and it's not a metal, so that's down to 0. And then again, what we can do is, if I've got a rubber variation, because you can't actually paint on these fill layers, you can create masks and paint through masks to bring the underlying layers back through. But with rubber variation, I can click on here, and then I could keep the diffuse as normal, disable the height, roughness, keep that as normal, metallic, just disable that. And then we can go in here and we could, which you wouldn't do, but just for an example, make it super shiny. And I'm going to just change the color as well. And I'm just going to go in and paint on here. And as you can see now, that's super shiny where everything else isn't. And if we look at the maps, that's the roughness. So it's darker, so there's less roughness, more reflectivity going on. And the diffuse, as you can see, there's no lighting information, so that's great. And that's using the rubber material. So that's the two opposites of the scale. One for the metals and one for insulated materials. So what I've been working on recently is the abandoned cinema scene, street scene, and this is a table for the pub, the interior of the pub that I was working on yesterday. And you can see in here we've got some slight rings where some of the drinks have been, and you can see the reflectivity of the wood. And now there's variation in there where there has been some beer stains and sticky parts, and where some of the varnish is still on and where it's not. And also I've gone in and with the Wacom pen and just scratched off certain areas and even put in some heightness to it. So like at the bottom where you can see it's quite scratched underneath, and you can see some of the wood coming through. And all the materials and the texture maps have been done for me anyway. So if I go through, if I click C, so that's going to be the albedo. As you can see, there's no lighting information in there, so that's nice. That's the height. That's the roughness. And metallic, obviously. The small medallions there, they are gold, so they are metallic, and the wood is not. And then I just go into File, Export All Channels, and then I've brought these into Photoshop, and this is what it exports. They're at 2K, so at the minute I'm 50%, so that's 100%, getting lots of detail in there. Always work at a higher resolution, and then you can always downscale rather than upscale, obviously, because then things get blurry. So the great thing about when you export from Substance Painter, it does this excellent kind of bleeding where it doesn't actually go into the next UV shell, but for when you sometimes zoom out on an asset in a game, you might start to get a line, or kind of like a black line or something. Well, this, by adding further colour around your actual UV shells, it stops that from happening, because it kind of bleeds into the same sort of colour. We've also got the roughness map, so you can see here this is where more of the scratches are, because the white, the more rough. It's got the rough wood underneath, and where you got the variation on the wood is where there's been some beer spill, and where there's more varnish, and where it's all been kind of worn off. It's just brilliant, nice and quick, nice and fast. I will be doing some more slight overlays to this, either in Substance Painter or in Photoshop, but that's the great thing about the roughness map. That's where you can get some of your artistic ideas and place them into there for surface scratches and things. Metalness, it does a slight bleed on the metalness itself. You can clean that up and just have it as pure black, and then they would just be pure white, but I'll leave that because it doesn't actually go into the UV shell, so that's still great there. And the height map, and you can just generate a normal map from the height map. I found that trying to generate a normal map from Substance Painter, for some reason the green channel doesn't seem to export correctly, but it is in beta version, so it may be something that they're looking at, or I'm doing something fundamentally incorrect. Perhaps I need a base normal in there before actually exporting everything out. But at the minute what I'm doing is I'm just taking that height map, either running it through Endo2 or through Nold, and then you can generate a normal map, and that gives you a little more control as well. You can start to control if you want it a bit more sharper or a bit more deep or less. So once you've got all those 4 materials, you can then just plug those into the Unreal Engine 4 along with your asset, and it should look pretty much exactly the same as it did within Substance Painter. I hope this tutorial was useful. As I say, I'll leave a link down there for the Marmoset toolbag tutorial. It's quite sparse at the moment regarding on the internet regarding graphs and values, but once Megascans comes out, I believe there's 1,000+ textures which are all PBR physically correct values. So I'll be subscribing to that, and then I can go in, and if there is any real variation in what I've been doing at the moment, then I can just go in and change that, and then everything within the scene that I'm creating will be correct. My portfolio's at www.rpiper.co.uk. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me on Facebook. If you've got any questions or anything like that, give me a shout. I'm hoping all your 3D projects are going well as also at the moment, and if you've got any questions or queries, pop something in the comments, and I'll be sharing more techniques and tips with you as soon as I can. Thank you very much, and have a great week 3D modelling. Thank you. Goodbye.